Okay, so this is the second part of Chapter 17 from my book, and we're beginning to talk about the historical grief models. A brief paragraph on medical models, Otter Weiss, Solomon and Green. They use a extreme perspective, more extreme than Lindemann. They suggest that a biological relationship exists between the psychological and physical well-being of individuals. And through observations, they found that individuals, they can experience negative respiratory, cardiovascular, immune system functioning, autonomic or endocrine system responses to the loss stressor. Littlewood believes that this seems plausible, and I do as well. Most people would call these psychosomatic, but they believe they're actual detrimental reactions to our physical well-being. And this also lends itself to a lot of the statistics showing that loved ones who lose a significant other or somebody very close to them also have a much higher percentage of much higher mortality rate themselves within the first year. And we talked a little bit about that when we went over the introduction. So the next section is task models, and this is where Warden falls, as well as another prominent theorist named Rando. So let's look at some of the task models, specifically beginning with Warden, and he wrote the textbook that we're using, and he will go into much greater detail into his own task model. He integrates a lot from the earlier theorist. Basically, he took all of the things that he believed were appropriate from the earlier theorists and integrated them into a task model. And a task model really means that we are active participants in the grieving process. And I do believe that is true. So some of the four major tasks that he believes is involved in the process is to accept the reality of the loss, to experience the pain of grief, to adjust to an environment in which the deceased is missing, and to emotionally relocate the deceased and move on with life. So those are very basic task steps, but it gets a little more involved. So let's look and see what else is involved with this. So of course, most theories talk about our first step, and that is understanding the reality of the loss. Whether the steps involve a numbness, a disbelief, whatever it might be, coming to grips that, yes, this is a reality. That's a very difficult and emotional first step. And we often have physical and emotional reactions to that very first step, depending on the amount of trauma connected with that initial loss experience. It's a cognitive task, but also an emotional task, I believe. It has to be performed prior to subsequent tasks. The second task is affective, more emotional. It involves experiencing that pain, that emotional pain of grief itself. Individuals experience a broad range of emotions in order to grieve. this loss, their loss. Those emotions include a lot of the emotions that were mentioned in previous losses and in the introduction. The resolution of the task is ongoing as individuals work through their grief. The third task, adjusting to the environment without the physical presence. It involves the individual who's no longer with us. And he states that it's pervasive, it's a continuous aspect of the grief process. As we encounter different environmental stimuli, such as locations, other people, events, like the events that I mentioned during that first year of loss. This is what Warden is talking about. Music, holidays, some of the most pronounced memories and connections I have with loved ones have to do with music that I hear, or smells, or holidays. So some of the most vivid memories can be recalled through smells. And as we move through that first year, all of those things become stimuli, triggering memories and drawing out emotions that are connected with the individuals that we love. So the completion of this task may be long-term as individuals encounter situations that remind them of the deceased. The final task is also emotional in nature, and it involves moving on with our lives. And some people may feel that that is harsh, but life moves on whether we want it to or not. And I believe that we need to reintegrate the relationship in a new way. Warden has drawn from recent research modifying this specific stage and drawing from Rando, incorporating a lot from her theory, which we'll talk about. People do not decathect. I don't know if that's correct. Decathect. Deconnect from the dead, but find ways to develop continuing bonds with the deceased. One must find a place for the deceased that will enable the mourner to be connected with the deceased, but in a way that will not preclude him or her from going on with life. So it's finding a new connection, and for me personally, that connection is how that individual continues to play a role in my life, and how I have integrated that relationship into who I am, how I act, how I feel, how I interact, that I-thou experience with others in my life, how I re-examine my own life, how I've changed and grown as a result of that relationship with other. So I believe he took a lot from Rando in redefining his stage theory. They both stress the need to consider mediators of the mourning process in order to understand why individuals handle the tasks of mourning in different ways. Warden identifies 7 mediating variables: how the person was, the nature of the attachment, going back to Bowlby, the mode of death. Was it traumatic? Was it peaceful? Was it anticipated? Historical antecedents. What went on in that relationship? Personality variables. How do we deal with stress and loss? Social variables. Concurrent stresses, such as socioeconomic stresses. And in addition, Rando adds physiological factors, our physical reaction. So let's look at Rando. I believe she is one of the most advanced grief and loss theories. And we have the 6R processes of mourning. Avoidance. Recognize the loss. Acknowledge the death and understand the death. Very similar to Warden. Confrontation. React to the separation. We experience the pain. We feel, identify, and accept, and give some form of expression to all the psychological reactions. And we identify and mourn secondary losses. Secondary losses have to do with other things that were connected with that relationship and that individual. Like traveling with them. Friendships with other people that were mutual. And we recollect and re-experience the deceased and the relationship. We review and remember realistically. We revive and re-experience those feelings, and we relinquish the old attachments to the deceased and the old assumptive world. And then accommodation. We readjust to move adaptively into a new world without forgetting the old. We revive the assumptive world. We develop a new relationship with the deceased. We adopt new ways of being in the world. We form a new identity that integrates that relationship, that individual, and we reinvest in our future with an integrated relationship. So I believe that is a much more healthy way to move through the process of grief and loss. And then this talks about each phase in detail. I'm going to end this section of our lecture before we move on to other grief models like Robert Niemeyer, who are very contemporary. Because I'm going to cover those grief models when I begin talking about my own grief model. When we talk about regret therapy and death anxiety, a comprehensive model of death anxiety, my comprehensive model of grief and loss, and how to deal with those losses through regret therapy. So that's the first part of this chapter, the historical aspect of grief and loss models. And then we'll move on later with more contemporary models of grief and loss. Before I move on and end this session, remember to complete all of the reading assignments and watch the video, the first lecture, and read Tuesdays with Maurice, the assigned chapters. And then make your first post in the discussion board, the initial post, with your reaction to some of this. Some insights, some reaction you have by Wednesday at 10 p.m. And then 2 discussion board reactions to something that other people have posted, at least 2 other people, by Friday night at 10 p.m. So, good luck with this brief semester, and I hope you find it rewarding.